Billionaire dairy families. Hello, friends. This is everybody's favorite subject. Probably one of the very first billionaire dairy families in the world would be the Stewart family that owned Carnation Milk Farms. And they revolutionized the dairy industry for two reasons. Number one, they were the first family, the first business to have a shelf-stable liquid dairy product. Right after a lot of other companies were doing lead cans and stuff like that, they figured out how to do a tin can and then evaporate the milk. And this, fueled the gold rush, this and that. And the second way they revolutionized the dairy industry was with genetics. They brought the best bulls they could find to the Pacific Northwest, spread them out all over the West Coast, and then got into AI. And years later, decades later, Carnation Genetics became Landmark Genetics, and Landmark is still active, I believe, in the artificial insemination industry. And when the Stewart family went off the stock exchange in 1986, they sold out to Nestle. Estimates were $600 million at that time the family was worth. Since 1986, Nestle stock has increased 778%, giving the family a potential net worth of $6 billion. Meanwhile, at a 4% dividend. And so those dividends have paid. If the family could get by on $24 million a year, they could get by without touching the principal. Fast forward to 1996, I was at a Monsanto meeting for BST. It was a food and drink event. One of my best skills was food and drink events. But anyway, Dennis Holliday was the editor of the California Dairyman, Western Dairy Business Magazine. And he talked at that time, and he made a prediction, and I can't remember his numbers, but he predicted that the outflow of real estate money from Southern California would completely revolutionize the dairy business. And he was correct. Now, how it happened, you don't know, but the first big wave of that money came out of there in the 80s and 90s, and it crashed on states like Idaho, New Mexico, Texas. And the second wave of that money has since gone out and has ended up in places like Illinois, Indiana, Michigan. And just simply through the rules of 72, the rule of 72, some of these families came out of Southern California with, let's just say, 25 million. And all you got to do is just let it double every 5 to 7 years for 30 years, and you're now approaching $1 billion. And so how have these families survived, right? That's a very finite amount. Well, there's a bunch of D's involved. They've avoided divorce, right? And when there was a divorce, that was handled separate from the dairy business. Like the Stewarts, they've lived off the dividends. And then they've also diversified. And not necessarily diversified away from the dairy industry, but they've diversified their sales markets. They're selling powder in Idaho and cheese in Texas, fluid milk in the Chicago area. Fairlife now is building a huge plant in New York. So some of that Chino money, that Artesia money, is crashing into the New York dairy industry. And then they've diversified where they get feed. They might be feeding cattle in Nevada and New Mexico and milking somewhere else and this and that. So there is some diversity there. Now, is this a nefarious plot by corporations to screw over rural America? And, the answer is people wanted to move to Southern California. They wanted a piece of American dream, which is a house. And where you used to milk 500 cows, you could put 500 houses, and on and on and on, it's gone. And just by wisely managing that money. And so now back to the 90% of us that are $1 million or less. When grandma dies, and there's $600,000-$700,000, what do we want? Do we want 4% dividends? You know, or do the 10 grandkids want to settle to split up, you know, $24,000 a year? Everybody gets their check for $1,800? Hell no. We all want the principal. Give me that money. Give me that principal. And so when you set up, when you train your kids, are you training them to, you know, live off their labors and the dividends, and to avoid squirreling away the principal, and to avoid divorce? And, you know, so now back to the cattle business. You know, should we be borrowing money to do cattle, this and that? Well, or robot. Well, if you make a generational screw up, you get to start back at zero, right? So there's some of these families that have kept things together generationally and use that money and lived off the dividends, and they'll keep winning. They've got a head start, and every time that you jack the family back a generation, you got to start at zero again, and there's always an impossibility of catching them. Does that mean that we don't try? Well, no, of course not. You know, if you're the generation that can put together 2 or 3 million this generation, and train your kids to, like I said, live off their labors and the dividends, maybe you can be the impetus to have your family in 100 years be in that position, right? Because it's been 100 years now. It's been 100 years since some of those families came from Holland and first started hand milking in Bellflower and those areas. It's been 100 years, and you know, can we use those again? Is that a ploy of corporate America? That's just a bullshit excuse people say when they screw up and the family's got to start over again. So who are you going to be? Are you going to be the person that starts out, does the saving, provides the framework for your family to succeed, or are you just going to gobble up the principal? God bless you. Have a happy Labor Day.